Today I'm going to talk to you about papers that we've been doing at the Center for Social Media and Politics involving YouTube. And I'm going to actually be showing you parts of two different papers here in this talk, and if we have time at the end, I can show you parts of a third paper as well if you're interested. This paper that we're going to focus on here is how YouTube recommends content to real people. I want to point out that the lead author on this is Megan Brown, who's currently a research engineer at the Center for Social Media and Politics, and will be applying for PhD programs this fall, so keep an eye out for her. And like all the research that comes out of the Center for Social Media and Politics, it really does take a village. Lots of people's hard work goes into these projects. So this particular talk, I'm going to focus on this paper, looks at three different things, which I'll tell you about more as we go along. But I want to focus primarily on this question of YouTube and rabbit holes, right? So we've all seen the headlines about this. Forget Facebook, YouTube videos are quietly radicalizing large numbers of people, how YouTube built a radicalization machine for the far right, how YouTube drives people to the internet's darkest corners, the Zeynep Tufekci piece in the New York Times, and of course the ultimate memorable photo headline, I think this was The Atlantic, what happened after my 13-year-old son joined the alt-right. So let's try to think about this as social scientists. What is a rabbit hole? We hear talk about rabbit hole, there's a lot of fear about rabbit holes. So we're going to define a rabbit hole as a situation in which which we think most of these headlines are getting at. This is the sort of innocent 14-year-old who's just like looking for Marvel Cinematic Universe videos, ends up following YouTube's recommendations, and ends up on extreme content. So you start out on non-extreme content, you follow YouTube's recommendations, and you end up on extreme content. Now, what does this actually kind of look like in terms of a digital footprint? I'm going to explain in more detail what's on this slide later on when I talk about the methods later on into the talk. But on the y-axis of this slide, you've got a measure that we're going to show you how we got of the ideology of YouTube videos. On steps 0 through 20 here, these are what we call traversal steps. These are the number of times, and I'll explain how all this works, the number of times you can follow YouTube's recommendation off of a first see video. And this is what, and the bricks on this thing are the variety of videos that are recommended to you by YouTube at any one step. And this is a footprint of what we're like terrified of. You start off on an average normal video around right around the middle of the ideology. You get recommended a bunch of things. You choose one, boom, you're off to the races, and all of a sudden you are getting only recommended extremist content. This is what a rabbit hole looks like. So hopefully we have a definition of it. We have a kind of conceptual footprint of it, and keep that in mind. Now the paper actually looks at whether or not YouTube recommendation algorithms lead you into echo chambers, ideological echo chambers, whether it leads you down these rabbit holes, and whether the YouTube recommendation algorithm has an ideological bias. I'm going to focus in on the rabbit holes, but we'll come back and I'll show you the results on the other two at the end of the talk as well. All right, so what do we know about rabbit holes on YouTube? There are lots of anecdotal claims that are out there about rabbit holes on YouTube. We saw lots of stuff in the media. There are lots of examples that people can give. You present this talk enough times, somebody comes up to you and says, oh, this happened to my 14-year-old son. I watched one time that this happened. However, we also have data, studies that have started to be done on this. And the studies have been done using what are called, using either observational data, where we sort of track people's browser histories, and they've also used what are known as headless browsers, which are essentially when you make bots that go out and the bots watch YouTube videos and sees what happens to the bots who are doing it. With the observational data, you don't know if it's the person making the choice or what's being recommended to them. With the browsers, you tell them what they're choosing, but they're not real people. So our study was designed to see if we could figure this out by figuring out what happens with real people with real histories. Does the YouTube algorithm send them down a rabbit hole? Now, there's a couple of challenges in doing this research, and we did spend years in our lab trying to finally come up with a research design that works and building all the backbones to do all of this. But here's the fundamental challenge. There's a couple of fundamental challenges. One is, when you are using, if I just stick a browser data on you and watch you go to YouTube videos, two things are being picked up. What the algorithm is showing you and your choice. So any history we watch of a user is going to be a function of what happens on that is going to be a function of what YouTube is recommending and what you choose out of those recommendations. And when you use observational data, it gets at both of these. So the question is, how do we disentangle these two? And the solution here is to remove user choice from the process. So here's the study we designed. We recruited YouTube users to install a browser extension. So that's the first thing we did. They set up a browser extension. And then we gave them a randomly assigned video to start up. So we told them what video to go look at. They had a link, click on that link, see that first video. We had about, over the course of the study, we had like 4 different topics. Within each topic, we had 6 different videos. The idea was to make sure our results weren't driven by one particular video. We started as a seed, but we controlled the seed video. Then we tell them to watch the next 20 videos, but we tell them which recommended video to follow. So Nate might be assigned to always pick the second video. Other people might be assigned to always pick the third video, the fourth. We did it up to 5 videos because that's sort of what's on the top of the screen for most people when you see it in your browser. So we totally took out any decision-making on the part of the humans. But because we had the browser extensions, we could see at each step what videos they were being recommended and what video they followed based on our traversal rule. So that's the first challenge. So we think we figured out a way to do this, to get away and disentangle user choice from the algorithm. So that's super exciting. But the rabbit hole question, we wants to know whether we get led, as that picture I showed you at the beginning, to extremist content, right? Starting on a random video, does that eventually lead you to extremist content? This leads to the second major challenge. How do you estimate the extremity of a video? And how do you do it in a replicable way that's scalable as well? Now, I want to make one caveat here. Everything I'm going to be telling you for the rest of this talk has to do with what we are labeling ideological extremity. You could be concerned about other things, like you might be concerned about whether the algorithm leads you to violent imagery. If that's the case, then you would want to run a classifier on videos that picks up whether the videos have violent imagery. That's not what we're worrying about here. We're worrying about, does this take you towards the political extremes? And the solution to this, we spent a lot of time on this as well, but we have a paper. It's currently R&R Political Analysis, which is the political methodology journal in political science. And you can download it. It's up. It's on the web right now. We have the preprint copy or draft copy of it on SSRN. So anyone who's interested in taking a look at this can look at this in more detail. The lead author on this is Angela Lai, who's a PhD student in the Center for Data Science at NYU and a graduate research associate at the Center for Social Media and Politics. So here's what we ended up doing to come up with a replicable, scalable way of estimating the ideology of YouTube videos. There has been a lot of incredible research that's been done on allowing us to estimate latent dimensions of behaviors across domains. This has been one of the biggest developments in political science, in particular in the study of Congress over the last 30 years. My late colleague Howard Rosenthal with Keith Poole sort of pioneered this type of approach. And what we end up having is we see this getting replicated throughout the social sciences as a method of estimate of putting actors on an ideological scale. So the first and sort of key way that this was done, that brought this into the discipline, was this famous word called nominate. For those of you who are political scientists, anyone who studies Congress knows this, where we create essentially a matrix of people's votes in Congress on bills. And that gets you a series of ones and zeros for each member of Congress that they vote for or against the bill. And from that, you can decompose a latent dimension of the members of Congress, also of the bills. And that latent dimension tends to match very well the partisanship of the members of Congress. We've also seen this now expand into legal fields, where people have used the same type of similar methodology to look at, to try to scale the ideology of Supreme Court justices. We've seen it applied to interest groups by looking at ratings given by interest groups to politicians. We've seen this by Stanford's Adam Bonica has pioneered this by using campaign contribution data in the same way to estimate the ideology across lots of professions of people. Some of you may have seen some of his papers here. We've done this in our lab previously with Twitter data, using follower networks on Twitter to estimate the ideology of Twitter accounts. And then more recently, we have another paper where we've been doing this using the domains shared by people on Twitter. So you look at who shares Fox News, who shares MSNBC, same all basic methods. Okay, so the big picture idea here is that we took this basic approach using networks to pull out a latent dimension and to see if it scales, if it looks like ideology, to videos. But instead of having people, like vote on videos, right? The way that we did this, where we were able to create this network, is we conceived of subreddits as actors. So what we have is we have two steps to this method. I'm going to explain them each in detail. The first step is we look at networks of how videos are shared across different subreddits on Reddit. That follows this familiar sharing on domains method. That allows us to get a latent dimension, which gives us an estimate for approximately 50,000 videos that we found that were shared on enough political subreddits to get these estimates of them. Those 50,000 videos are then used in a secondary text classification thing as a training data set to train based on the metadata that accompanies those videos. So like the titles of the videos, the descriptions of the video. We use a text-based analysis, one of these huge new transformer language, or I guess they're not that new anymore, but these transformer language models where we're able to use the text around the videos to train a model to then classify the rest of the YouTube videos. So this is not a methods discussion, so just to walk you through this kind of quickly. So for those of you who do not know about Reddit, Reddit is a kind of online bulletin board. It's like the most throwback to the early days of the internet versions of the social media data sites. Crucially for us, it's divided into subreddits based on discussions of particular topics, and there are lots of political ones. We're specifically interested in politically oriented subreddits, so things like our politics or our conservative, and we actually get extra credence from the fact that people on Reddit vote posts up or down, so you can kind of get like crowdsourced annotations of whether they actually make sense in the context of that Reddit. Okay, so a first step of getting the ideology of the video, we have our behavior, which is that people post YouTube videos to different subreddits. So our group here is we think of the subreddits as group. Like in this case, the subreddits are the legislatures, and in a sense, the legislatures are choosing which videos to vote yes or no on. So the subreddits are doing. Now, obviously, it's more complicated than that because anyone can post to a subreddit, but that's basically the network that we're using, and this allows us to get this latent dimension of video, and the latent dimension, fortunately for us, like many other latent dimensions, tracks nicely with ideology. So on the basis of this network-based analysis, this is what we end up with in terms of this continuum across ideology stores here. And so if we look at the bottom left hand, we see like Democratic Socialists of America, Yang Gang, Progressive. If we look in the middle, we get things like world news, classical liberals. We start as we get into the red side of it, we get conservatives. If we look at the edge of the extreme, we get things like white pride, counter your vote, college Republicans. Anyway, so this is basically, so we get this, puts this on this scale. It's not perfect. It's definitely not perfect. But it does a very nice job of giving us 50,000 labeled videos on a dimension that looks ideological, that looks pretty ideological. The second step, we use these 50,000 videos as training data. We put them through a BERT transformer classifier, and the output is we can now have a trained transfer learning model that allows us to get estimates of the ideology of any video that anyone encounters in the course of our traversal study. And here's this is when we aggregate across, so as a validation exercise, the first validation exercise, there are people who've done more qualitative research on YouTube, and they have put videos into different categories. And this is one such study of this where they put different videos. They identified channels that were far right, right, center, left, and far left. And these are the ideology of the distribution of the videos that fit into those channels. So we didn't come up with those 5 categories. It's very nice, I think, face validation of the value of this method. Here's another way of looking at it. We aggregate up the channels, and like you look at like right broadcasting network, as you know Paul Joseph Watson, like on the right, Fox is on the right. Then we have in the middle, ABC News, Vice, C-SPAN, and then we get out, interestingly enough, the late night television shows on the left there as well. Okay, we also then did a form of human validation. Now this is really tough. Getting human beings to watch a video tell you whether it's liberal or conservative, and then are they using the same scale? What are you doing across videos? So what we did, and I'm totally interested in this, I think this was fairly clever. People came up with this in the lab. What we did was instead of asking people to use an abstract scale, we gave people a series of pairwise comparisons. So we just randomly surfaced 2 of the videos. And we asked them to identify which was on the left and which was on the right. And then we looked and saw the extent to which our human coders matched what our classification score said. And on the x-axis here is the distance between the 2 text-based scores, the scores that we got out of our classifier. So as you see, when our scores are basically the same, it's like 50-50. Some people think one's more conservative, some people think the other one's more conservative. Makes sense, our scores basically can't distinguish between them. But as we get wider and wider, as we get more and more distance between our scores, we get more and more clarity among the humans. So that's a third way that we try to validate.
Josh, can I just say, try to stay in the middle. People on Zoom can't see you if you go off that way, so try to stay in the middle. As hard as it's going to be this, yeah.
Okay, all right, okay, all right. There's got to be some advantage to being in the room. Yeah. All right, okay, all right. So what are the benefits of this method? We can actually code all videos on YouTube and get a first cut at what we think the ideology of them are, that we think on average is pretty good, with enough metadata. So as long as users are providing titles, descriptions, categories, the things that people provide when they upload videos, we can actually scale this to any collection of data. The second thing about it is it's dynamic, right? We can figure out new videos. You can retrain this thing, right? Like it's not like a one-shot deal where you brought people in to code a bunch of videos and you're stuck with your coding of videos from late 2021, right? We can train this thing when we want it. There's no need for human labeling. And that, I think, when you're getting, and this is going to be beyond the subject of this talk, a lot of my lectures now end with, and the big challenge going forward is as we move from text to video, because we've learned a lot about coding text. Video is a whole other thing. Images are hard enough. Video is the next frontier. You don't need human labeling in this method. So we think that's a huge advantage. The only humans that are in the loop in this process are the original decision of which subreddits to select. So future research could look at the robustness to that decision, and then in the validating stage. And even we try to take humans out of the loop of the validating stage as much as possible, but our pairwise comparison involves humans. Okay, that's the method. So now we've solved both of these challenges. We have a way to isolate out what the algorithm is recommending to real people with real user histories, with real subscriptions to channels, real people, and we have a way to estimate on that scale that I showed you originally, the ideology of videos that are being returned by the YouTube algorithm. So here's our full research design put together. As I said, we recruit the YouTube users to install the extension. We randomly assign them seed videos. They then follow the traversal rule to select the recommended video. These last 2 points are for different papers that we've done. If we have time at the end, I can show you more about them, but we do survey them afterwards. Okay. So how does this work in progress? So we start out, your video, you get assigned a seed video. You as the user go to the seed video. We know the ideology of the seed video on our scale that we give you. Then you get recommended on the top, right? You get this list of recommended potential other videos you watch. We can scale the top one. We can scale the second one. We can scale the third one, the fourth one, etc. We can then create a digital footprint of what the YouTube recommendation algorithm looks like. This kind of like, it's cool. I think it's cool looking, right? And so we get a footprint. Okay, that's the spread that we got off of that set of recommendations. We then tell the person, in this particular case, you can't see because it's the, oh no, it isn't there. In this particular case, we told them, pick that video, they watch that video, then they get another set of selections, another set of selections, another set of selections, and we have them do this 20 times, and we capture the entire digital footprint. So again, this is what a rabbit hole looks like. This is an example of a not rabbit hole looking like. Okay, so what do we learn about this? What do we find? To be clear, if we take the distribution, right, of these steps, if we were in a rabbit hole world, remember the rabbit hole world, naive 14-year-old just looking at kind of moderate stuff, they follow the recommendations, they get sucked into the extremes. We would expect it to look something like this slide here. So the idea here would be on your first set of recommendations, those are pretty kind of widely distributed. But if you're being sucked into a rabbit hole, in this case it's a right-wing rabbit hole, but it could be the flip of this. If you're getting sucked into a rabbit hole, you'd be pulled a little bit in your second set, maybe 6 through 10, you start seeing it tightening up, it starts pulling you to the right, and then for the last set by the end, you really get pulled off to the right. That's what a rabbit hole will look like. All right, so what do we actually find when we plot this data? On this figure, on the y-axis, you see the distribution of videos across ideology, and on the x-axis, it's unique, but on the y-axis, we have the steps that we've gone, the number of traversals, so 0 through 5, 5 through 10, 10 through 15. This is the distribution for your first 5. So, and this breakdown, just that you can see it, blue is the distribution of liberals, red is the distribution of Republicans, or conservatives, and this is, we ask people, these are people we recruited to take the study, so we ask them, are you conservative, are you liberal? And then the purple is the overlap between them, so you can see there's a lot of purple in there. And there's another color. All right, that's the first step. Remember, for our rabbit holes, we would expect this to tighten up and go to the right. 6 through 10, 10 through 15, 15 through 20. It doesn't tighten up and go to the right. Again, this is what the rabbit hole behavior would look like. This is what we actually see as our distribution as we go along these 20 steps. Now, this is putting a ton of data onto one particular slide. Let me tell you our big conclusions here. First, there's no evidence of YouTube recommendation algorithm pushing users to extremist content. That's the first point. Second, and I think this is really important, we did find some rabbit holes. Like, we used the definition of rabbit hole as like you start in the middle and you end up in the top 10% on the ideological distribution over the last 5 videos. But they were super rare. We had our subjects do 527 of these 20-step traversals, and it happened 14 times. But I think this is important for wrapping your head around the phenomenon of why people believe this story is so prevalent. Because it's not that it never happens, right? Like, if you're a 14-year-old that's going to watch YouTube videos 500 days in a row, you don't have to be worried that every day they're going to, well, you might need to be worried. I'll explain that in a second. But from this, you shouldn't be worried that every day they're going to innocently start off on Marvel YouTube videos and every day they're going to end up with flat earth or stuff. But it might happen occasionally. And if you've read about it in the New York Times and you see it happen once, well, we know from psychology, you can confirm things from seeing rare instances of it. You don't remember the 400 times it doesn't happen, but the one time you're like, oh, it happened, like a rabbit hole. I've gone down a rabbit hole. And so they're out there. So I actually think that's important for understanding the phenomenon of why there's such widespread belief in these things happening. Now, the caveats about this, 2 important caveats, because I do not want you to walk out of here and say, YouTube's fine. YouTube doesn't play any role in radicalizing people. The first is this is extremist ideological content with some noise in it, not violence or other forms of extremism. I think you could use our entire methodology, but use a different classifier, and you could study other things that you want to do. And we super hope that people will build off of this methodology to do more studies like this. The second thing is there is nothing I have told you here that doesn't say that YouTube is not full of extremist content, nor that it may not be a tool of radicalization. We've done other studies where we try to look systematically across billions of things to see how much horrible stuff is out there. That's not what I just showed you here. I showed you 547 traversals by people we recruited online to do these studies. It also doesn't mean that YouTube can't be a tool of radicalization. In fact, one of the things that I've shown you is that there are at least 50,000 links posted to YouTube videos posted on the subreddits we chose to scrape, right? That do link back to where there's lots of links, 50,000 videos for which there's lots of links, enough for us to conduct these estimates on YouTube, right? So there are ways that YouTube can be a major problem in terms of radicalization, but it suggests that it's not because of this inadvertent activity where the algorithm lures in unsuspecting people, but that there are more, it can absolutely, consistent with our evidence, and we haven't looked at this, but consistent with our evidence, it can absolutely serve as a repository for radicalizing information, which you can then send people to on Reddit, and you can try to find people on Reddit, you can try to recruit people on Reddit, you can do this all over the place, you can do this on WhatsApp, you can do it wherever. But the issue may be that the issue with YouTube and radicalization, nothing I've shown you here, let's put it this way, nothing I've shown you here suggests that we can rule out that YouTube could be a problem for radicalization because it's a repository for extremist content that people who are interested in it can access. And that doesn't mean, first of all, it might be that your 14-year-old actually is interested in extremist content, and that could be really problematic. And there might be horrible people out there who are trying to find your 14-year-old and get your 14-year-old interested in extremist content. It's just probably not the YouTube recommendation algorithm acting on its own that's doing this. By the way, I'll show you the two other super interesting things that we learned, the other things that I told you we would talk about, which is that in terms of ideological bias, if you look back here, one thing you do notice is that these all seem to be moving to the right. This is something we've never seen actually reported on before, but there seems to be this rightward drift as you go down more traversals. And we actually put this through some more rigorous analysis, and we see this repeatedly, that there is this kind of drift to the right. This is going up on this scale over time for both Democrats and Republicans. The other thing you see here is a little bit of a split between liberals and conservatives. You can also, if you peek real close at this one, you can start to see these, like, there's more, a little more spread across these different ones as you go forward. But we particularly see this when we use moderate seed videos and conservative seed videos, so you get a little bit of the spread. So we do see a little bit of evidence of the algorithm may be pushing people towards weak echo chambers, which makes sense if you think there's any kind of political feedback in the recommendation model of this. So, you know, so we find overall the magnitude of the difference between liberals and conservatives is small, but it does seem to increase the longer they follow the recommendation algorithm. So the recommendation algorithm may be contributing to very mild echo chambers. If you go into steps 15 through 20, conservatives and liberals are seeing more different stuff than they are at steps 0 through 5. But I don't want to overstate this because all the way 0 through 20, they're seeing a lot of very similar things. Rabbit holes are very rare, and YouTube pushes all users, regardless of ideology, towards more center-right and increasingly narrow content. So these are the authors on this team, and me. We got 25 minutes left. Do you want me to show the other paper?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. Bonus. We'll show the other paper. I'm going to try to be quick about this. There's going to be 3 papers in a 40-minute talk, so this is a good one. All right. Okay. That's we go. All right. So one other thing I'll show you right now, and then we should still have time left for Q&A. We did this study in the late fall of 2020. And and that was great because we had started, the first time I ever stood on a whiteboard talking about this study was like in the fall of 2017, I think, trying to game out how we could try to do this. We went down a lot of rabbit holes that were not productive in doing this research before we arrived at what I showed you. But then after we were analyzing the data and then things went kind of haywire in the late fall of 2020, we realized that we had been running a study we had all these records of what videos people were recommending to YouTube users after the election of 2020 in the immediate months afterwards. Moreover, we had surveyed people during this study about their feelings about election fraud. And so we thought, we could look at the extent to which there's a relationship between the content YouTube is showing, recommending to people, and people's pre-existing feelings about election fraud. Now, to be very clear, this is like a study you cannot do with headless browsers, right? Like these are like real people, so we really asked them, what are your feelings about election fraud? Okay, so same basic setup as the last one. We get them to install, it's not the same basic setup, it is the same basic setup, same people that I showed you in the previous paper. But here I want to highlight that we have this battery of election skepticism questions. All right, so we asked them things like, when do you expect to know the winner of the election, blah, blah. Please indicate how concerned you are about fraud, about all of these different things. All right. So the research question we set out to answer in this paper was, what's the relationship between a user's skepticism in the election and their YouTube recommendations for election fraud-related content? As an added bonus, we can just tell you a little bit about the prevalence of fraud-related content afterwards. All right, so here, the challenge the challenge becomes, how do you actually measure fraud content? And so I'm not going to go into great detail on this. This is incredible work that was done by Jim Bisbee, who is a postdoc in our lab, who's the lead author on this paper, who's now an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University. But we basically use, again, metadata that was provided around the videos, and this time we actually also use transcript data and then run an LDA analysis on this. Here's all the it's a bespoke one. We sort of came up with this, but we basically were running LDA topic models on these things and then searching for the prevalence of fraud keywords in the main words that are popping up as distinguishing the topics from each other. For those of you who do topic modeling, that's basically what we did here. And then we assigned a sort of weighted average to each of the, anyway, we did this. And what we ended up with was measures for how prevalent fraud-related topics were across videos. And so we could look at the extent to which different people were seeing more videos that had heavier weights on the topics that were associated with election fraud. Then, because as it was pointed out to us after we did the first draft of this paper, we don't know actually if the election fraud videos were debunking election fraud or promoting election fraud. So we did some hand labeling to get a sense at the distribution across our videos. All right, so to give an example of this, topic 108 was the most prevalent election fraud topic. What videos were high in topic 108 based on the LDA model? Well, White House press briefings, which shouldn't really be high on them, but things like massive fraud, and Rudy Giuliani shows up, the Ophelia document shows up, News Now from Fox. There were a lot of things that come up here that are showing up as higher. All right, so what we did was we just made a simple model to try to predicted the proportion of election fraud contents in a user's traversal across those 20 videos. Right here, we're not worried about the step in the video, it's different, just a different thing. We just want to see how much it shows up as a function of their skepticism of election results. And here are our main findings. Okay, on the top, which is underneath, this top here is our indices. So we had a fraud index, we had an illegitimacy index, and we had a combined fraud and illegitimacy index. These are the subcomponents of the fraud index. These are the subcomponents of the legitimacy index. For those of you on Zoom, I'm pointing towards the top third as the indices, the middle third as the fraudulent indices, where it says fraud, and the bottom four is legitimacy. The key, the summary statistic across everything is the second bar from the top, which is our combined fraud and illegitimacy index. And the black, if the circle is in black, that's showing significance correcting for multiple hypothesis testing. But if it's white, it was significance. If it was white with the dark bars, it was significant, but without collecting for multiple hypothesis testing. And then if it does the short bars, it's insignificant. And what we see is that when we combine the data across all of these indices, people who were more skeptical about the elections were shown more videos. Now, how many more videos were they shown on this? Oops. All right. Here's an example. Okay. All right. Here's an example for our fraud number topic 108. If you look at the people who were the most skeptical, they were on average shown out of the 200 videos that they saw, right, there's 27 videos, or 400 videos they saw 13 as opposed to 2. This is of the topic 108. It depends how you want to look at this. On the one hand, there was not a ton of these election fraud videos, and I'm sorry I don't have the slide in here because I wasn't really prepared to give this talk today. But what we do find is that of the election fraud videos, the majority of them, in our hand-coded ones by our students, the majority of them are ones that are promoting stories of electoral fraud, and then minorities of it are debunking electoral fraud or sort of neutral on it. We didn't find in the 400 videos people saw a lot of these videos. right? On average, an average person saw about on average, our people who were the most skeptical saw about 8 videos related to electoral fraud out of 400, and the people who were least skeptical saw, I believe it was 2 videos related to electoral fraud. So on the one hand, there wasn't that much of this out there. It wasn't like dominating people's thing. On the other hand, we didn't send people out to search for information about electoral fraud either. On the other hand, the people who were more skeptical clearly did see more of these videos than the people who were less skeptical. So the answer to the question is, did YouTube recommend misinformation to users most likely to believe it? Yes, but the videos were rare on the platform. And the second point is that we wonder, after having done this, about the extent to which platform level moderation might work better than individual recommendation level based interventions, right? Because most people weren't seeing that many of them. But if we look in the aggregate, and this is from other work that we did, this was the number of Twitter shares of links to YouTube videos, election fraud related videos. So we looked at these videos and then we looked at their links to them on Twitter. What we see is that both times that the platform makes a commitment to reducing the amount of these videos, there's way fewer links to it on Twitter, right? So we have this increasing after the election, we have this whole thing, and then in December 2020, YouTube made this decision to downweight and reduce the importance of these election fraud related videos. That's when we see a big drop by almost half in the percentage of links that we're finding on Twitter in these videos. And then after January 6th, when they really tried to crack down on it, we saw an even bigger thing. So yes, YouTube definitely showed more. We think YouTube did show more videos to people who had more election skepticism, but we think the real action in terms of reducing the prevalence of these videos and their spread may be more likely to come from big steps on the platform than it is in this individual level recommendations. So our conclusions from this paper is YouTube recommends harmful content to only a small number of people. Only a small number of users fall into the so-called rabbit holes. Small numbers of users are recommended more election fraud content. However, because YouTube is so large, these small harms may affect larger numbers of people. There's more work to be done, blah, 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 lots of stuff. Anyway, so huge thanks to Megan Brown, Jim Bisbee, and Angela Lai, who were the lead authors on these 3 different papers that I've seen here today. And I'm super happy, looking forward to discussion and answering any questions that you have on this work. So thanks, everybody.
Sit down, but I don't think that will, if we sit down, they won't be able to see us, right? They will.
Yeah, that's fine.
So if you want me to sit down, move that closer to the middle. Let me see who's got questions, otherwise I'll start. Yes.
My name's Robert. I think I met you actually once at Facebook.
Okay.
I'm curious, have you thought about publisher level effects? So like, it's not necessarily pushing individual people, but are you publishers and have you studied that?
Yeah, so we worked so hard to get to the video level so that we wouldn't be at the domain level, so we could actually say more precise things about it. I mean, you can certainly use any of the methods that we've discovered here to aggregate back up to the publisher level. I would put the publisher level in the sort of realm of the intervention that we showed at the end. I don't know what YouTube did to try to get those dramatic drops in the videos that are coming out. That might very well have been a publisher level intervention. It may have been a video level intervention.
Well, I can tell you, that's when YouTube took the most dramatic steps against election fraud narratives of all the platforms, because they imposed in December a rule that took it down.
And they did that at the video level or at the publisher level?
Video
level.
And so the fact that you're seeing that drop off is not surprising to me. Whereas other platforms ended up labeling and downranking. I mean, you said downranking. There's certainly some of that goes under, and it depends what it says, of course. But questioning the results of the election, they in December started removing this.
Yeah, and what you see is once you start removing the videos, people stop sharing links to them.
Yeah. So can you just, for purposes of explanation here, can you just clarify a little bit the difference between rabbit holes and echo chambers?
Sure.
So we're all on the same page as to what you're talking about there.
Yeah, so an echo chamber so the definition of an echo chamber is you go online and you see things that are only ideologically congenial to you. So like, if we thought about Facebook, a friendship echo chamber would be liberals are only friends with liberals, conservatives are friends with conservatives, and you don't have liberals and conservatives being friends with each other. In the context, what we meant by echo chambers is, does the recommendation push liberals to start seeing different videos from conservatives? So you would think of an echo chamber as if you start off with these things overlapped on top of each other, those curves I showed you. I mean, there's actually other slides, I'm not gonna go back to that. An echo chamber, they would go like this, right? They'd start to diverge from each other. And if we saw it in 0 through 5, it was like this for liberals and conservatives, and by 15 through 20, it looked like this. That would suggest the algorithm was pushing people into echo chambers, right? They wouldn't have to be extremist echo chambers, they would just be different from each other. I mean, we've had some debate about this in the lab. I actually think it's like this, right? An echo chamber would also like start to shrink the variance within these groups because you'd be hearing more and more similar stuff. Whereas a rabbit hole, it goes like this, right? Now, you could have a rabbit hole and echo chambers if it went like this, right? Like if all the liberals were taken off to liberal extremist content and all the conservatives were taken off to conservative extremist content, that would be both an echo chamber because liberals and conservatives would be saying things different from each other, and they would both have gone to extremes. And instead, what we found was like this. They ended up with a lot of overlap, drifting a little bit to the right. Neither of these distributions went to the extremes, but they really didn't diverge much at all.
We've got several questions on Zoom, but let me just ask one, and then I'll go into the room here, which is, one good question I thought was, how do you deal with ads? Because ads are essentially embedded, they're part of the experience. There is that whether it's political ads or other things, are they just taken out? They're not part of the evaluation of the recommended videos.
Yeah. So all we scraped was what was the video that they recommend that showed up on that part that I showed you in the slide was what was recommended out there. You're right. There's more. And that's the thing about video. There's tons of data in video, right? But in this particular case, what we got was what was the video. And then once we had the video, we went to the API, got the metadata for the video, and then we ran the metadata through our classifier.
So this is amazing. This is
Oh, thank you.
And I've just been trying to get my head around, was it 3%? Yeah, it does happen. It happens rarely, but it does happen.
Right.
But 3% of enormous user fee,
Right.
user field, and it's just huge, right? Numbers.
Right.
And of course, when you start from the headlines are YouTube radicals, and then they just assume if you go down a rabbit hole, you will be radicalized. Right. And so, do you have any sense at the end of this rabbit hole, what percentage are really radicalized, and how many actually easily find themselves back on the rabbit hole?
Right.
Because then 3%,
Right.
you're really worried. 3%, well, it's 3%.
Right. So my first thought is, man, it took us forever to estimate the ideology, and now you want us to be able to figure out when someone's been radicalized and de-radicalized who we've never met before based on their YouTube browsing history that we don't have. So I'll take this shortcut out and say, like, that's a totally different research project, and there's different ways that you decide that. Let me tell you why I'm not worried about 3%. As a father of someone who was 14 years old while I was working on this paper who likes Marvel cinematic movies, is that think about your state of the world. Right? Imagine there are two states of the world that explain if you could be radicalized by algorithm, right? Like, I am very worried about being radicalized by bad actors. And I think the fact that there is a never-ending repository of videos that bad actors can send people to see to radicalize them, I think that's really problematic. I also am really worried about self-radicalization. Something happens to somebody, they get interested in something, they search for it. There's a repository of stuff they can self-radicalize. I think the anti-vaxxer movement is like a case study in these kinds of things, right? But we're worried about, the stories here was radicalization by algorithm. So I could imagine a state of the world where every time my 14-year-old son looked for things about Marvel videos, he gets taken to Nazi propaganda. And he really likes Marvel videos, and he keeps seeing Nazi propaganda over and over again. What 3% to me means if my kid goes 100 times to look at Marvel videos and goes to 20 video recommendations produced by it, occasionally they're going to come across some weird stuff. That to me doesn't seem the way that we get radicalized. Like that a kid who is looking at, YouTube videos every day, watching 20 videos a day for 3 months, once a month encounters some weird stuff. That's not how I would design up a that would lead that person. What generally happens is like, he goes, Dad, I saw some crazy shit today on YouTube, right? Like that kind of comes out there. Like, so I think that's why the 3% to me, it is what it is. And I'm willing to be convinced by other people. And again, there's heterogeneity, right? Like there might be, like we have a whole, I don't know, this is the next time I come out here. We have a whole new project that we're working with Pat and Jim Bisbee, who was the lead on that, actually brought that. We've been, again, I think that's been many years in the making, on looking at white nationalism, right? And determinants of white nationalism. And one of the things we've been testing in there is correlates of white nationalism with strain theory, like bad things going on in people's lives. So it might be that for a person who is going through a particularly rough time, the relationship has just ended, and they're trying to relax with Marvel videos, and they one time see this Nazi video, and then they decide they're gonna start paying attention to that. Like, I can't rule out that hasn't happened, right? But I don't think we think that most people, when they encounter something once in a while on YouTube, that like changes their mind views. I think it has to be a more deliberative process. I will, however, tell you something totally fascinating from that white nationalism project, which is that we came up with a way to measure people's sympathy for white nationalism. This is a whole other project. Actually, maybe I won't go to this right now. There's other questions there. Oh, all right. I'll tell you. So we came up with our recommendation. Right. Okay. So we came up with a way to measure people. They're willing to self-identify as a white nationalist. We looked at all sorts of correlates of it. We just presented this at AppSet. If anyone is interested, I can send you the paper. One correlate that came out being enormously strong was we came up with a new question, which we had never seen asked before, was we asked people to name their 3 closest friends who were not a spouse or family member. And then we asked them, how many of those friends do you know entirely offline, online and offline, or entirely online? The people who knew all 3 of their closest friends were entirely online. They were 4 times as likely to self-identify as a white nationalist as the people who all 3 of their friends they knew either online or offline and online. Now, it was small numbers, right? But still, it was much, much higher. So maybe there are people out there for whom the internet is particularly dangerous. But then again, I would also say when your 3 closest friends are online, that's a recipe for meeting people online who have ulterior motives, who then may try to radicalize you by sending you the content. So, yeah.
Thanks a lot. Again, really cool research this time.
Oh, thank you.
Just a quick question about temporal aspects here. I guess this only gives us an image of how the recommendation engine works when you ran the experiment, right? So it's conceivable that it might previously have been full of rabbit holes and echo chambers, but due to criticism that tinkered with that's possible, yes?
Yep, it's totally. I mean, that's totally correct. And I think it points to a fact that Nate and I have written about extensively. Chapter 13 of our book, Social Media and Democracy. If you don't have it, it's available for free download. We don't have the data to be able to answer these questions. I mean, like, I wish I had run this study every year for the last 8 years. I especially wish I'd run it for the first 3 years I was doing other things with this study that were not panning out. But yeah, you're right. Also, we don't know what it's like in 2022. It could be worse again. We really just don't know.
I think there is, knowing what I know from the platforms, that the change in the algorithm made a difference. That to the extent there was greater likelihood in the early 2010s to move toward whether it's echo chambers or rabbit holes, that has been mitigated because of all the criticism.
Right.
I think last question,
Yeah, thank you so much. Again, that was really fascinating. I just had a question around, so the selection of the videos is totally randomized system. We always selected video 2, always selected video 3. And I think we talk about
chose the recommendation. So we randomized the seed variable.
Yeah.
We had 24 different seed videos, and then they were assigned a rule for, and by the way, I don't think we actually did this, but originally when I drew it up on the blackboard, what I thought we were gonna do was like, also some person, like we're gonna have one person who was gonna be assigned to like, pick a different one than they did last, like would be, not that, it would be like assigned, we'd give them a pattern, like 1, 3, 5, 2. There's nothing, we weren't trying to find out anything about always picking the second one. But I think people decided that would be too hard to give them a more complex pattern, so we just stuck with pick the first, pick the second. And the compliance rate on that was super high, which we could monitor.
Yeah, I guess my question is more to is there sort of videos that tend to be almost like carrot sticks? Like if we can push the rabbit hole narrative further, is it that there are some videos that might stand out to people that are like, oh, that's interesting, I'm gonna click on that, and that's what kind of leads people down. So maybe there's 5 videos, 4 of them are kind of banal, but then one of them is like a carrot stick that's almost
Yeah.
a human agency.
So that's definitely a shortcoming of our design. So our design, because we wanted to take out the human element, and we really wanted to say, does the algorithm produce recommendations that lead you in this direction? Does that lead you down these rabbit holes? And so we deliberately stripped out the ability to see what people were actually attracted to because we precisely didn't want that in our study. You can get that from observational data. So you can see what happens with observational data on that. On the flip side, we certainly didn't, well, I don't actually think it was flip. I was gonna say, like, we certainly didn't find any differences across seed videos. We didn't find any differences across rules that we did or something like that. But you're right, we might, if there was a special, a carrot stick in this that was more likely to lead people down the rabbit hole, this particular design wouldn't do that. But in a sense, that's an easier question to answer because you could just stick browsing, you can just look at any observational data and you can see if there are particular videos that lead down particular holes. The problem is, even then, if you do that with observational data, you won't know whether it was choosing this video that mattered or the hundreds of choices that person made before they ever got to that video. And that what's really going on here is the fact that they were offered that video, that they chose that video, they're both a feature of some underlying variable, which is like curiosity about climate denial, right? And that has led them to subscribe to certain channels and do this or something. We've done 4 more. Quickly.
Oh yeah, so I was wondering about, it seems like the number of videos matters in this case. So what's on the training set and then on the platform you have an estimate of like how many or what share of the videos are right-leaning versus left-leaning?
Of the training of the 50,000 that we
Oh
got.
yeah, and on YouTube. So are there
Yeah.
more right-leaning videos and how does this composition that influence?
Right. So the method that we have put, I'm not prepared, so 2 things here. I'm certainly not prepared to say that the 50,000 videos on which we could get estimates are a representative sample of what's on YouTube, because these were videos that got posted a lot in political subreddits. So I wouldn't say anything about 50,000 videos. On the rest of them, it wasn't what we set out to do here. It's computationally costly to get all this metadata. You have to hit the API, you have to collect it. So we collected the metadata for all the videos that are in those digital footprints we did of our 540 people. So I wouldn't call that a sample. We do, however, have, at CSUN, we haven't thought about this, this is a great idea. We have been collecting a random sample of YouTube videos for a long time, So, and I believe if we have the metadata for those videos, then we should be able to not only get a sense of the extent to which there's more conservative versus liberal content, but we should be able to see if it changes over time.
Yeah.
But we haven't done that yet. That was beyond the scope of this project.
Let me just ask one last question, which came over Zoom from someone who works at one of the firms, which is if you are a platform that's trying to deliver content to people that they like.
Yep.
But you want to avoid rabbit holes and echo chambers, what should you do?
Well, I mean, I think you want to deliver content to people they like. That is for the last paper, the election fraud paper. That's a real problem, right? Like, I think that you face a fundamental challenge. If the model of your platform is to deliver people content they like, what do you do with people who like bad content? So the platforms haven't had difficulty deciding that about, YouTube has no qualms about saying, you know what, we're really not going to give people who like child pornography more child pornography. Well, and that's simple because it's illegal. But are we going to give election deniers more stuff about election? Are we going to give people who believe that they can, prevent getting COVID by having horse tranquilizers more videos about horse tranquilizers that are going to prevent you from getting COVID? That's the fundamental crux of the matter, and that is always going to be a problem that these platforms face if they use algorithms that prioritize giving people content they want. And I get it. Like, it makes for a more enjoyable experience using these projects. There is a way to get away from this, which is reverse chronological feed, where you have the platform stop trying to figure out what people want. The problem is that doesn't even solve it, because then I can just follow a bunch of people who are all people who produce horse tranquilizer videos, right? And then I'll see that. On the other question about how to avoid radicals and how to avoid echo chambers, and give people what they want to see, I think the rabbit hole issue, right, shouldn't come from a function of giving people what they want to see. Because if you think about it, if you think about what we're trying to do here is we're looking at a kind of distribution of videos that are, you know, liked by more people and viewed by more people, and that are, you would expect things that are in the center of a distribution, around the bell, you know, the bell curve, in the middle of the distribution, that those would be more popular, right? And if you're trying to give people more popular videos, that would probably keep you from sending them down rabbit holes. On the other hand, if you totally prioritize user history and like you're looking at engagement, every time somebody gets to an extremist video, they watch it for 3 minutes, and every time they get to one of the popular videos you show them that's moderate, they watch it for 2 seconds. You are going to end up sending them down rabbit holes, right? Like, unless, and I have no idea, out to a person there who's got a platform working on this, right? Like, I have no idea if you were right that this was more prevalent 5 years ago, what are the changes they made, right, to do this? And I think that's a more complex question that's going to involve, I think, thinking through this question of how do you recognize the user. Now, maybe it's like violence. Maybe it's that you reduce for things of violence, but of course, there's unanticipated side effects of that. You also then reduce things about police brutality. You reduce things about authoritarian regimes that are attacking protesters. So these are, I mean, I think these are really complicated questions. The echo chambers issue is one which I do believe can be addressed algorithmically, like in the sense that, like, if you know liberals are going to prefer liberal content, you know conservatives are going to prefer conservative content, but you also can identify liberal and conservative content, you can set up, you know, you can decide how much you're going to weight whether or not you prioritize the political recommendation as over, say, the subject recommendation or something like that. I mean, we know that they draw on lots of different things in recommendation algorithms, so, you know, you can decide to tweak it. But whether showing liberals more conservative content is going to make the world a better place is actually not a solved question at this point, even making that more complicated.
Thanks so much. Next week, we've got 2 speakers. We've got Tim Wang, the General Counsel of Substack, who's also an ignorant theorist in many dimensions, talking about what we call microeconomics of disinformation. And then we've got Joe Donovan and Emily Dreyfus from Harvard, who are going to be talking about their new book, Meme Wars, next Thursday. So tune in or attend. Great.